Spite tastes like battery acid. I swallowed it down anyway when I dragged a scarred, foul-smelling vagrant into the city's most exclusive registry office. I did it to burn my mother's pristine world to the ground. I expected a miserable, petty victory. I expected a lifetime tied to a helpless, pathetic man. I didn't expect the beggar to look at the city skyline with eyes that calculated its exact market value, or to realize I had just legally bound myself to the predator who owned the cage. The air in Brooke Kelly's office was suffocating. It smelled of bleached white orchids and synthetic pine, a sterile manufactured perfection that made my lungs burn. I sat on the edge of the leather sofa, the material squeaking softly under my damp palms. "Dominic Croft," Brooke said. She didn't look up from her mahogany desk. The scratch of her fountain pen against thick cream-colored paper was the only sound in the room. "The papers are drafted. The press release goes out on Friday. You will wear the ivory silk suit I had tailored for you. You will smile. And you will stop this pathetic, lingering rebellion." I stared at the sharp manicured nails gripping the pen. "Dominic broke his last Omega's jaw," I said. My voice sounded thin, reedy. I hated it. I cleared my throat. "He's a brute mother. Everyone knows it. He is the heir to Croft Industries," Brooke replied, finally lifting her chin. Her eyes were a flat glacial blue. "He is an alpha with capital. You are an omega whose scent is starting to turn sour with age. You are 25, Ryan. The market for you is closing. You will marry him, and you will secure our family seat on the board. Do I need to remind you who owns the lease on your little art studio, or who pays for your suppressants?" The threat wasn't new, but it landed with the heavy, blunt force of a lead pipe. She would cut me off. She would leave me on the street, unmedicated, vulnerable to the first passing alpha who caught my heat. I stood up. My knees shook. I locked my jaw to stop my teeth from chattering. "I'd rather marry a rat out of the gutter," Brooke laughed. A short, dry sound, like snapping twigs. "You don't have the spine to even look at the gutter. Be ready by Friday." I walked out. I didn't take the elevator to the lobby. I took the stairs, all 40 flights down my expensive leather boots, echoing hollowly in the concrete stairwell. With every step, the panic in my chest curled tighter, wrapping around my ribs like rusted wire. Dominic Croft. Heavy hands, breath smelling of stale gin eyes that looked at Omegas like they were slabs of meat on a butcher's block. I had seen the bruises on Dominic's previous partners. I'd rather marry a rat out of the gutter. The thought echoed in my mind, shifting from a defensive retort to a frantic, clawing idea. In this society, an Omega could only be matched once. A marriage contract once filed and stamped by the Central Registry was ironclad. Only an alpha could dissolve it. If I was already married, legally irrevocably bound to an alpha, Dominic Croft wouldn't touch me. Brooke's contract would be void. Her social standing would be humiliated. I pushed through the fire exit into the alley behind the corporate tower. It was raining. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, spilling freezing water over the neon-lit streets. I didn't open my umbrella. I let the cold rain soak through my cashmere coat, shivering as I walked away from the pristine financial district and toward the lower wards. The transition was abrupt. The clean pavement gave way to cracked asphalt. The smell of high-end exhaust and roasted coffee morphed into the stench of rotten cabbage wet cardboard and the sharp, unwashed tang of feral pheromones. I kept my head down. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my sternum. Omegas didn't walk down here. Not alone. Not without thick scent blockers and a guard. I passed a row of rusted dumpsters. A group of betas huddled around a burning trash can, their eyes tracking my expensive clothes. I quickened my pace, my boots splashing in oily puddles. I needed an alpha with a pulse and a citizen identification number. Nothing else mattered. I found him sitting under the crumbling overhang of an abandoned subway entrance. The man was a hulking shape, wrapped in a filthy, oversized military surplus coat. He sat on a piece of flattened cardboard, a battered tin cup resting near his heavy mud-caked boots. His head was down, obscured by a tangled mess of dark, greasy hair. The rain drummed relentlessly against the concrete above him, creating a curtain of gray water. I stopped. I took a hesitant step closer. The man didn't move, but the air around him suddenly felt dense. A scent pushed through the stench of the alley, faint, muffled by dirt and rain, but unmistakably alpha. It didn't smell like the polished cedar or bergamot of the men in my mother's circle. It smelled like wet copper, like burnt coffee grounds and ozone right before a lightning strike. It was harsh, bitter. "Excuse me," I said. My voice cracked. The man slowly lifted his head. I sucked in a sharp breath. The left side of the man's face was ruined. A jagged, angry burn scar started at his temple, dragging the skin taut down his cheek and disappearing into the thick, unkempt beard along his jawline. His right eye was a pale, washed-out hazel. His left eye, surrounded by the scar tissue, was half-lidded and dark. He looked terrifying. He looked exactly like the kind of monster Brooke Kelly would cross the street to avoid. "I don't have change," the man rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "I don't want your money," I said. I wiped the rain from my eyes, my hands trembling violently. I want to buy your name." The man stared at me. The pale hazel eye tracked down my soaking wet cashmere, the expensive watch peeking out from my cuff, and finally back up to my pale, terrified face. "You're lost, little Omega. The velvet rope is about 5 miles uptown. I have $10,000, I blurted out. I unzipped my coat with numb fingers, pulling a thick envelope from the inner pocket. It was my emergency fund. Everything I had secretly scraped together over 2 years. $10,000 in cash, right now. If you come with me to the registry office and sign a marriage certificate." The rain fell harder, drowning out the distant wail of a police siren. The man didn't reach for the envelope. He just kept looking at me. The gaze was unnerving. It wasn't the desperate, hungry look of a beggar seeing a fortune. It was calculating. Cold. "A marriage certificate," the man repeated slowly. "Yes. You sign the paper, you take the money, and we never have to see each other again. You get off the streets, and I swallowed hard. I get ruined." The man leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The movement was surprisingly fluid for someone so large and seemingly broken. $10,000 to ruin yourself," he murmured. "Must be a hell of a mother." I flinched. The casual accuracy of the deduction stung. "Will you do it or not?" The beggar looked at the thick envelope, then up at the towering skyscrapers, barely visible through the rain and smog. A strange, twisted smile tugged at the unscarred side of his mouth. "Sure," the man said, pushing himself up to his full towering height. I had to crane my neck to look at him. He smelled violently of damp wool street grime and that sharp biting copper. "Let's go get married." The Central Registry Office was a building designed to intimidate. Vaulted marble ceilings, brass fixtures, and a distinct lack of natural light. It usually smelled of expensive perfumes and quiet, desperate negotiations. Today it smelled like an open sewer. I stood at the counter, ignoring the horrified stares of the clerks. Next to me stood my husband-to-be. I had forced the man who introduced himself simply as Graham into the closest discount clothing store before we arrived. Graham was now wearing a $30 black suit. It was a disaster. The fabric was cheap, shiny polyester that strained across his broad chest and shoulders. The sleeves were an inch too short, exposing thick, scarred wrists. The burn mark on his face was stark and livid under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mud still caked the sides of his boots, leaving brown flakes on the pristine marble floor. "Name," the clerk whispered, pressing a tissue over her nose to block Graham's scent. "Ryan Kelly." The clerk's eyes widened. She recognized the name. Everyone knew the Kelly family. Her gaze darted frantically to Graham. And the Alpha. "Graham," he rasped. "Just Graham. He needs a surname." I snapped, my anxiety spiking. "Give her a surname." Graham looked at me, that pale hazel eye gleaming with a quiet, unreadable amusement. "Cole. Graham Cole." Identification. The clerk demanded, clearly hoping to find a reason to deny the application. Graham reached into the inner pocket of his filthy overcoat, which he refused to take off, wearing it over the cheap suit, and pulled out a battered, faded ID card. It was valid. Barely. "Print here, sign here," the clerk said, sliding the heavy registry tome toward us. Her hand was shaking. I picked up the pen. The metal was cold. For a split second, the reality of what I was doing crashed over me. This wasn't just a tantrum. This was the end of my life as I knew it. I was tying my legal standing, my medical rights, and my bodily autonomy to a homeless drifter to avoid Dominic Croft. It was jumping out of a burning building without checking if there was a net below. I pressed the nib to the paper. Scratch, scratch. Ryan Kelly. I passed the pen to Graham. Graham took it. His hands were massive, the knuckles thick and calloused and grained with dark dirt. But his grip on the pen was strangely elegant. He signed his name in a sharp, slashing script that looked entirely out of place for a man who slept on cardboard. Before the clerk could stamp the page, the heavy double doors of the registry office burst open. "Ryan," the voice cracked like a whip across the quiet room. My stomach plummeted. I turned slowly. Brooke Kelly stood in the doorway, flanked by two massive alpha bodyguards in tailored gray suits. She was a vision of terrifying elegance, a sharp cream coat, flawless makeup, her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Her blue eyes locked onto me, then slid to the towering, disheveled mess standing next to me. The color drained from her face, replaced instantly by a flush of absolute murderous rage. She crossed the marble floor in rapid, clicking strides. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "Get away from that filth. Right now." "It's done, Mother," I said. I hated how my voice wobbled. I forced my chin up. "Meet my husband." Brooke didn't yell. She moved with shocking speed, her hand lashing out. The slap echoed like a gunshot in the vaulted room. My head snapped to the side. A sharp sting blossomed across my cheek, the taste of blood instantly filling my mouth, where my teeth caught my inner lip. I stumbled back, waiting for the second blow. It didn't come. When I opened my eyes, I saw a thick, scarred wrist intercepting Brooke's arm mid-swing. Graham had moved. I hadn't even registered the shift in weight. 1 second, the beggar was slouched against the counter. The next, he was standing between me and my mother, gripping Brooke's wrist. The two bodyguards lunged forward, snarling their heavy pine and musk pheromones flaring in aggressive warning. Graham didn't let go of Brooke. He simply turned his head and looked at the two guards. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't release a cloud of dominant scent. He just stared at them with his one good eye. It was an infinitesimal shift in posture, a sudden terrifying stillness. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The metallic tang of wet copper didn't spike, but it suddenly felt heavier pressing down on the back of my neck, like a physical weight. The two bodyguards stopped dead in their tracks. Their aggressive sense faltered, turning sour with sudden instinctive hesitation. They looked at Graham, then at each other, profoundly confused by their own sudden reluctance to engage. "Don't touch him," Graham said. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried perfectly. Brooke ripped her arm away, her chest heaving. She wiped her wrist on her expensive coat, as if Graham had infected her. She looked at me, her face a mask of pure disgust. "You think this is a victory," she spat softly. "You think you've won. You are dead to me, Ryan. Your accounts are frozen as of this minute. Your apartment lease is canceled. Let's see how long your petty rebellion lasts when you're starving in the gutter with this freak." She turned on her heel and marched out, her guards hastily following her, eager to be away from the beggar who had somehow frozen them in place. I stood shivering in the quiet aftermath. The clerk slammed the heavy stamp down on the book. Thud. "Congratulations," the clerk squeaked. "You're bonded." I turned to Graham. The adrenaline was draining out of me, leaving me hollow and dizzy. "Here," I said, holding out the thick envelope of cash. My hand shook. "Take it. Go." Graham looked at the money, then at my bruised, bleeding cheek. The heavy scarring on his face pulled into a frown. "She canceled your lease." Graham pointed out, his raspy voice flat. "Where are you going?" "That's none of your business," I snapped, defensive and terrified. "We had a deal. Take the money." Graham didn't take the envelope. Instead, he reached out, moving slowly so as not to startle me, and gently pushed the envelope back against my chest. "Keep it," Graham said. "You're going to need it to buy me dinner. My wife owes me a meal, doesn't he?" I stared at him, bewildered. "What are you talking about? Take the money and leave." "We're married, Ryan," Graham said. The way he said my name, rolling the R slightly, his voice a deep rumble, sent a strange, involuntary shiver down my spine. "Till death do us part. Lead the way." My apartment was a miserable fourth-floor walk-up in the mid-tiers, a neighborhood that tried very hard to pretend it wasn't sliding into poverty. The radiator clanked violently, protesting the sudden drop in temperature outside. The window above the tiny kitchenette leaked a steady drip, drip, drip onto the cheap linoleum counter. I dropped my keys into a chipped ceramic bowl by the door. I didn't take off my wet coat. I just stood in the middle of the cramped living room, staring at the floorboards. Graham closed the door behind us. The click of the lock sounded deafening. The space was too small for the Alpha. Graham's broad shoulders seemed to brush the narrow walls. The cheap polyester suit clung to him, damp from the rain, smelling of wet dog and old copper. He stood near the entrance, his pale eyes scanning the room, the threadbare sofa, the stacked canvases in the corner, the half-empty bottle of cheap suppressants on the counter. "You can sleep on the floor," I said. My voice was entirely devoid of emotion. The crash had finally hit me. I was exhausted, bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. "I'll go to the bank tomorrow. Try to withdraw whatever she hasn't frozen yet. Then you leave." Graham didn't argue. He shrugged off the heavy, foul-smelling military coat, dropping it unceremoniously onto a wooden chair. He reached up and pulled the cheap clip-on tie from his neck, tossing it aside. I couldn't help but look. Without the bulky coat, Graham's physique was undeniable. He wasn't soft or bloated, like many of the destitutes in the lower wards. He was built like a brick wall, thick slabs of muscle shifted under the thin, straining fabric of his white shirt. Scars, some old, some angry, and pink, peeked out from his collar and cuffs. "Got anything to drink?" Graham asked. I pointed numbly to the kitchen counter. "There's cheap whiskey in the cabinet." Graham walked into the tiny kitchen. I watched him, expecting the clumsy, eager fumbling of an addict. Instead, Graham opened the cabinet, retrieved the bottle of amber liquid, and found 2 clean tumblers. He poured the drinks with a steady, practiced hand. Exactly 2 fingers in each glass. He walked back and held one out to me. I stared at it. "I don't drink." "You do tonight," Graham said quietly. I took the glass. Our fingers brushed. Graham's skin was rough like sandpaper, but surprisingly warm. I took a sip. The cheap liquor burned like fire going down, making me cough, but it sparked a small ember of warmth in my freezing chest. I looked up at Graham. The alpha was holding his glass loosely in one hand, swirling the liquid slowly. He wasn't gulping it down. He was holding the cheap chipped tumbler as if it were a crystal highball glass in a private lounge. He lifted it to his nose, took a brief sniff, and then took a measured, appreciative sip. It was a tiny detail, a subtle, bizarre physical contradiction to everything the man was supposed to be. Beggars didn't nose cheap whiskey before drinking it. "Who are you?" I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. Graham looked at me. The scarred half of his face remained immobile, but the right corner of his mouth twitched upward. "I'm the rat out of the gutter you decided to marry." "Don't play dumb," I snapped, suddenly angry. The alcohol was loosening the tight knot of fear in my stomach. "You read the registry contract faster than the clerk. You held off 2 of my mother's trained enforcers with a look. And you didn't take $10,000 in cash when I offered it to you." I took another sip of the whiskey. Homeless people don't turn down 10 grand. Graham walked over to the threadbare sofa and sat down. The springs groaned in loud protest under his weight. He leaned back, spreading his arms along the top of the cushions. He looked entirely at ease in the cramped, leaking apartment. "Maybe I decided a lifetime supply of your charming personality was worth more than 10 grand, Graham said. I scowled. I set my glass down on the coffee table with a loud clatter. "Listen to me. I don't know what game you think this is. I don't have a trust fund. Brooke just cut me off completely. The money in that envelope is literally all I have. I am worthless to you." Graham was quiet for a long moment. He stared at the amber liquid in his glass. When he finally spoke, the raspy, gravelly quality of his voice seemed to smooth out just a fraction. It became deeper, more resonant. "You think your mother is the only predator in this city, Ryan." The shift in his tone made the hairs on my arm stand up. "What? You walked into the Undercity looking for a shield." Graham continued, his pale eye locking on to me. "You picked the most broken, pathetic-looking thing you could find, assuming you could control it, assuming you could buy it." I faltered. That was exactly what I had done. Graham took another slow sip of his whiskey. "But you didn't look close enough. You didn't ask yourself why a man my size with my build was sitting in a gutter instead of working muscle for the local syndicates. You didn't ask why the other beggars gave me a 10-foot berth." My breath hitched. I instinctively took a step back. The scent in the room was changing. The smell of wet dog grime and cheap polyester was still there, but it was being pushed aside. Something else was bleeding through the cracks. It was the copper scent from the alley, but it was no longer stale. It was heating up. It smelled like blood drying on an iron anvil. And beneath it, deep and suffocatingly rich, was the scent of aged oak and crushed peppercorns. It was an alpha scent. But it wasn't just any alpha scent. It was pure, unadulterated dominance. The kind of scent that commanded boardrooms, crushed windpipes, and forced other alphas to their knees. It was a scent that required a genetic pedigree worth billions. My knees weakened. My omega biology recognized the sheer power in the air before my brain could process it. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter to stay upright. "Who are you?" I whispered, genuine terror finally breaking through my cynical armor. Graham reached into the pocket of his trousers. He didn't pull out the battered ID card this time. He pulled out a sleek matte black smartphone, a model that hadn't even hit the public market yet. He tapped the screen with a heavy thumb. "I told you," Graham said softly. "I'm Graham Cole." He placed the phone on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a notification. It was a banking alert. I couldn't help it. I looked. The text was simple. Transfer complete. Croft Industries hostile takeover initiated. Escrow balance followed by a number with so many zeros it made my vision blur. I looked from the phone to the scarred, ruined face of my husband. "Your mother wanted to sell you to Dominic Croft for a seat on a board." Graham said, his voice a low, terrifying purr. "She should have checked the market. I bought Croft Industries 40 minutes ago, while we were signing our marriage license." Graham tilted his glass, draining the last of the cheap whiskey. "Sleep well, sweetheart. Tomorrow we're going shopping." I didn't sleep. I lay on top of my thin, lumpy mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling until the gray, anemic light of morning crept through the blinds. I listened. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the rattling pipes and the heavy, rhythmic breathing coming from the living room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that phone screen. The impossible string of zeros. Croft Industries hostile takeover. I finally pushed myself out of bed when the smell of coffee hit me. Not my generic, chalky instant powder. This smelled like dark roasted beans, cardamom, and chicory. It was a rich, heavy scent that aggressively overpowered the apartment's usual baseline odor of mildew and stale air. I opened my bedroom door. I paused, my bare feet freezing against the warped floorboards. The vagrant was gone. The man standing at the tiny kitchenette was a stranger. Graham had showered. The bathroom door was open, spilling steam into the hallway. The wild, greasy tangle of hair had been ruthlessly chopped back and slicked down into a severe military short crop. The matted beard was completely gone. Without the hair to hide it, the full extent of the ruin on Graham's face was unavoidable. The burn scar was a violent textured topography of melted and grafted skin that pulled his left eye permanently downward. It dragged the corner of his mouth into a perpetual tight grimace. He was ugly, brutally, uncomfortably ugly. Yet the sheer imposing architecture of his jawline and the cold intelligence in his one good eye made it impossible to look away. He was wearing a dark gray suit. It wasn't the shiny polyester from yesterday. The fabric was a heavy matte wool that absorbed the dim light of the kitchen. It fit the massive width of his shoulders with millimeter precision, tapering down to a narrow waist. The crisp white shirt underneath was open at the collar, revealing the edge of a thick raised scar traversing his collarbone. Someone had been here while I was paralyzed in my bedroom. Someone had delivered bespoke clothing, a razor, and high-end coffee to a fourth-floor walk-up in the slums without making a sound. The realization made my stomach drop. The illusion of the harmless, pathetic beggar was completely shattered. I was locked in a tiny box with a phantom. "You take it black," Graham said. He didn't turn around. He was pouring a second mug. I crossed my arms over my thin t-shirt, shivering. "How do you know that—" "I know a lot of things about you, Ryan." Graham turned, holding out a plain white ceramic mug. The steam curled between us. I know Brooke has been threatening to sell your contract for 18 months. I know you pawned your grandmother's cello to pay for this apartment. I know you prefer acrylics over oils, and I know your heat suppressants are a cheap, generic brand that are slowly destroying your liver. I stared at the mug. I didn't take it. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Have you been having me followed? No. Graham took a sip from his own cup. I've been having your mother followed. You just happen to be the loose thread on her very expensive tapestry. Why? The words scraped out of my throat. If you have the capital to buy out Croft Industries, why were you sitting in a puddle in the wards? Why the coat? Why the smell? Graham looked down at his own impeccably pressed trousers, a dry, humorless huff escaping his nose. Because it's the only way to see the city as it actually is. When you wear a three-piece suit, people show you their masks. When you smell like a sewer and look like a monster, they show you their true faces. You learn a lot about a man by how hard he kicks a beggar. Graham took a step forward. The air instantly thickened. The oppressive scent of iron oak and dominance pressed against my lungs. It wasn't an aggressive spike. It was just the natural suffocating gravity of a prime alpha occupying a small space. I forced myself not to step back. I tilted my chin up, meeting Graham's pale hazel eye. And what did you learn about me? That you're desperate, Graham said softly. He reached out and wrapped my cold fingers around the warm mug. His touch was firm, calloused. That you have a vicious, spiteful streak, and that you'd rather burn your own house down than let someone else hold the keys. Graham let go of my hand. Drink your coffee. We have a car waiting. I'm not going anywhere with you. I said, though, I took a sip. The coffee was phenomenal. It made me hate myself a little bit. Your accounts are frozen, Ryan. Your lease was formally terminated at 8 a.m. Graham checked a heavy brushed steel watch on his wrist. The landlord will be here with the police in 20 minutes to evict you. You can stay and try to fight them with a jar of acrylic paint, or you can come with your husband. My breath hitched. I looked around the pathetic little apartment, the stacked canvases, the leaky sink. It was a miserable place, but it was mine. It's just stuff, Graham murmured, reading the panic on my face. Let it rot. I closed my eyes. The battery acid taste of spite from the registry office was gone, replaced by the cold metallic taste of a trap snapping shut. I had sought ruin, and I had found it. I set the half-empty mug on the counter. Where are we going? To put a collar on you, Graham said calmly. Figuratively speaking, of course. The vehicle waiting on the cracked curb outside my building was a sleek matte black armored sedan. It looked like a military asset dressed up for a funeral. The neighborhood kids, usually feral and bold, were huddled on a distant stoop staring at the two men in tailored suits standing by the open rear doors. The men didn't look like Brooke's polished bodyguards. They looked like ex-paramilitary contractors. Thugs squeezed into Tom Ford. They bowed their heads slightly as Graham approached. I climbed into the back seat. The door shut with a heavy vacuum-sealed thud, cutting off the noise of the street instantly. The interior smelled of rich, untreated leather and the faint, lingering ozone of Graham's scent. The Vanguard on 5th, the Graham told the driver. I stiffened. The Vanguard wasn't just a boutique. It was an institution. It was where the city's elite went to armor themselves in silk and vicuña wool. It was also where Brooke Kelly had her fittings every alternate Tuesday. I don't belong there, I said, staring out the tinted window as the slums blurred past, gradually replaced by glass facades and pristine sidewalks. Neither do I, Graham replied, scrolling through a tablet. That's exactly why we're going. When we pulled up to the glass storefront of the Vanguard, the heavy doors were already being held open, by a frantic-looking manager. I stepped out onto the pristine pavement. I was painfully aware of my own appearance, worn jeans, a faded sweater, scuffed boots. I looked like exactly what I was, a disgraced cut-off Omega. Then Graham stepped out. The manager, a beta in a plum-colored suit, hurried forward with a practiced, brilliant smile. "Welcome, sir. We are completely at your—" The manager looked up, catching full sight of Graham's ruined face in the harsh daylight. The smile shattered. The man flinched physically, recoiling a half step, a sharp gasp slipping through his teeth. Graham didn't blink. He just stared down at the trembling manager. The absolute heavy silence stretched until it became unbearable. I apologize, Mr. Cole." The manager stammered, his sense souring with pure, unadulterated terror. He bowed so low his nose nearly brushed his knees. "Right this way. The entire floor has been cleared for your privacy." I watched the exchange with a sick fascination. This wasn't the respect of the elite. This was the instinctual fear of a prey animal recognizing a predator that had wandered into the wrong biome. The inside of the Vanguard was a hushed cathedral of commerce. Mirrors, mahogany, and rack after rack of fabrics that cost more than my life insurance policy. "He needs a complete wardrobe," Graham told the head tailor, an elderly alpha who was sweating profusely despite the climate control. "Day wear, evening wear, formal. Only natural fibers. Nothing restrictive across the ribs." "I don't want your money," I hissed under my breath, leaning closer to Graham. "You don't have a choice," Graham replied, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated in my chest. "You represent me now. I won't have my husband walking around looking like a charity case." "Stand on the block, please, sir," the tailor requested, gesturing to a low velvet podium. I hesitated, then stepped up. I felt exposed, stripped bare beneath the harsh, multi-angled mirrors. The tailor approached with a tape measure. As the man reached around my waist to measure my chest, a sharp, suffocating wave of pheromones flooded the room. It wasn't a physical push, but it hit the tailor like a sledgehammer. The elderly alpha gasped, stumbling backward, dropping his tape measure. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, staring wide-eyed at Graham. Graham hadn't moved from his leather armchair. He was casually swiping on his tablet, his legs crossed. But his scent, the crushing iron and dark oak, had flared into a violent territorial warning. "Mine. Do not touch." "Mr. Cole," the tailor wheezed, practically shrinking into the mahogany paneling. I must measure." "Use your eyes, Harold," Graham said mildly, not looking up from his screen. "If you need to put your hands on my Omega to know how a suit should drape, I'm in the wrong shop." My breath caught in my throat. My Omega. The words were possessive, heavy with a primal weight that made my knees tremble. I looked at Graham in the mirror. "I'm not a doll," I said loudly, my voice echoing in the too-quiet room. I turned around on the block, glaring at the scarred alpha. "I didn't marry you to be your dress-up mannequin." Graham finally looked up. The scarred half of his face remained a tragic mask, but his right eye held a terrifying clarity. "You're not a doll, Ryan," Graham said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. He stood up slowly, the movement incredibly fluid for his size. He walked to the edge of the velvet block, stopping just inches from me. "You're bait." I stared down at him. "Bait for what?" "For Brooke," Graham murmured. He reached up, his rough, calloused knuckles brushing lightly against the bruised cheek Brooke had slapped the day before. The touch was agonizingly gentle, a stark contradiction to the violence radiating from his scent. "She thinks she controls the board. She thinks you are a pawn she successfully discarded. I am going to dress you in armor made of silk and diamonds, and I am going to walk you right back into her world." Graham's thumb traced the line of my jaw. I shuddered entirely, unable to move away. "We are going to take everything she has." Ryan Graham promised, the words tasting like iron and ash. "And you are going to have a front row seat to the ruin." The invitation to the Autumn Equinox Gala was traditionally printed on thick gold-leafed cardstock. It was the absolute pinnacle of the city's social calendar, a night where the elite gathered in the grand atrium of the conservatory to display their wealth, negotiate corporate sabotage over champagne, and parade their omegas like prize show ponies. I stood in the shadows of the atrium's vaulted entrance. My stomach churned a sour knot of anxiety, tightening with every passing second. I was wearing a midnight blue velvet suit. It was soft-yielding and cut so perfectly it felt like a second skin. Yet it felt heavier than a suit of iron. The silk shirt underneath clung to my nervous sweat. "Breathe," Graham said. The Alpha stood right beside me, a looming monolith in a stark obsidian tuxedo. He didn't smell like the gutter anymore, but he still didn't smell like the polished, sanitized men inside the ballroom. The scent of ozone, crushed peppercorns, and heavy oak was a dark bruised thing beneath the crisp lines of his tailored clothes. "I can't," I whispered, my fingers curling into tight fists to hide their trembling. "Dominic will be in there. My mother will be in there." "I know." Graham didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me it would be okay. Instead, he lifted a massive scarred hand and placed it flat against the small of my back. The heat transferred instantly through the velvet, a branding iron of pure, undeniable ownership. I gasped softly. My omega biology, starved and suppressed by years of cheap medication, seized the contact like a dying man finding water. A shameful, involuntary purr vibrated at the very base of my throat. I snapped my mouth shut, mortified, my cheeks burning red. Graham's pale hazel eye flicked down to me. The scarred side of his face twisted into a micro-expression that might have been satisfaction. "Let them look at you, Ryan. But remember who holds the leash." We stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding light of the ballroom. The grand atrium was a sensory overload. The clinking of crystal flutes, the heavy cloying stench of competing floral perfumes, the low hum of a string quartet fighting a losing battle against 300 calculating voices. As Graham and I descended the sweeping marble staircase, the noise didn't just fade, it died. It started at the bottom of the stairs and rippled outward like a shockwave. Heads turned. Glasses halted halfway to mouths. The collective scent of the room, a mix of smug contentment and sharp ambition, curdled into sudden visceral panic. I kept my eyes locked on the polished toes of my shoes, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could feel the stares peeling my skin back. They were looking at the velvet suit. They were looking at my unblemished face. And then their eyes were inevitably dragged up to the towering, disfigured monster whose hand rested possessively on my spine. "Well, well, if it isn't the little runaway." The voice was a wet, heavy slur. I froze on the final step. Dominic Croft stood blocking our path. The Alpha was broad entirely, too flushed from alcohol, and reeked of sour gin and artificial pine. Beside him stood a pale, terrified Omega, with a thick layer of foundation failing to hide the yellowing bruise along his jawline. Dominic's eyes dragged over my body, sticky and entitled. "I heard Brooke cut you loose. Looks like you found a sugar daddy in the burn ward. What a tragedy, Ryan. You were almost pretty." My breath hitched. 2 days ago, this man's name was enough to send me fleeing into the slums in the freezing rain. I braced myself for the inevitable explosion. I waited for Graham to snarl, to throw a punch, to act like the brute Dominic assumed he was. Graham did nothing of the sort. He didn't remove his hand from my back. He simply stepped down onto the marble floor, forcing Dominic to crane his neck slightly to meet his gaze. Graham looked at the intoxicated alpha the way one might look at a stain on a public sidewalk. Dominic Croft. Graham rumbled, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of heat. Former CEO of Croft Industries. Dominic sneered, puffing out his chest. I am the CEO, you scarred freak. Who the hell are you? Graham tilted his head. The pale eye was devoid of any human empathy. Check your phone, Dominic. You were voted out by the new majority shareholder at 4 p.m. today. Your security clearance at the corporate tower was revoked 20 minutes ago. You're trespassing on company time. Dominic laughed a harsh barking sound, but his eyes darted nervously. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. I watched the blood drain from Dominic's face. The florid red vanished, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. The phone slipped from his thick fingers, shattering on the marble floor. You. Dominic choked, his pine scent turning rank with sudden absolute terror. You're Cole. The buyout. Graham didn't acknowledge the stammering. He shifted his gaze to the terrified Omega standing next to Dominic. Take his wallet, Graham told the bruised Omega quietly. Take his keys. Walk out the front door and don't look back. He can't afford to look for you anymore. The Omega stared wide-eyed, then bolted toward the coat check without a word. Graham finally looked back at Dominic. The absolute crushing weight of Graham's pheromones hit the air. It wasn't a flare. It was a slow, deliberate suffocation. The invisible pressure of ancient oak and iron forced Dominic to physically stumble backward, his knees buckling until he hit the edge of a catering table. If you ever speak to my husband again, Graham whispered, the sound carrying effortlessly through the dead-silent ballroom, I will buy the bank that holds your mortgage foreclose on your home and ensure you spend the rest of your life sleeping on the same cardboard I used yesterday. Get out of my sight. Dominic didn't argue. He scrambled sideways, tripping over his own feet in his desperation to escape the suffocating aura of a true apex predator fleeing the atrium like a beaten dog. I stood paralyzed. I felt a dizzying, terrifying high spreading through my chest. I looked up at Graham's ruined face. The monster was terrifying. The monster was cruel. The monster was entirely mine. Come, Graham said, his thumb pressing gently into the velvet at the base of my spine. I believe your mother is by the champagne fountain. The penthouse was a sensory deprivation chamber. After the suffocating heat and noise of the gala, the absolute silence of Graham's residence was jarring. High above the smog, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass, the apartment felt less like a home and more like a sterile, high-altitude observation deck. Everything was slate-brush steel and cold leather. I kicked off my dress shoes. The soft thud echoed sharply in the cavernous living room. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the cold glass, looking down at the grid of city lights below. I felt entirely hollowed out. The confrontation with my mother had been brief and brutally bloodless. Brooke had tried to publicly humiliate us, completely unaware of who she was speaking to. Graham had simply handed her a folded piece of paper, a copy of a forensic audit detailing years of her illegal offshore tax evasion. He told her she had 48 hours to resign from her board positions and leave the city, or he would hand the original to the federal prosecutors. I had watched my mother's pristine glacial facade crack and shatter into a million jagged pieces. I had wanted this. I had begged for this ruin. But watching her physically collapse into a chair gasping for air hadn't tasted like victory. It just tasted like ash. Drink this. I turned. Graham was standing a few feet away, holding a crystal glass of water and 2 small white pills. The Alpha had already stripped off his tuxedo jacket and unbuttoned his collar. The harsh recessed lighting of the penthouse caught the raised edges of the burn scar on his neck, highlighting the violent texture of the grafted skin. "What are those?" I asked, my voice rough. "Suppressants," Graham said. "High-grade, synthetic blockers." My brow furrowed. "Why are you giving me suppressants?" "Because your generic ones failed 3 hours ago," Graham said bluntly. He didn't move closer, maintaining a careful, calculated distance. "Your scent is spiking, Ryan. You're edging into a stress-induced preheat. If you don't take these now, you won't be able to stand up by tomorrow morning." I felt the blood rush to my face. I instinctively wrapped my arms around my waist. I had been so numb, so flooded with adrenaline, I hadn't realized the tight, heavy ache settling low in my pelvis. I hadn't realized that the sweet, cloying scent of caramelized sugar and bruised petals, my own natural omega scent, was steadily bleeding into the sterile air of the penthouse. "I don't need your pills." I snapped, defensive and deeply humiliated. I was exposing my biological vulnerability to a man I barely knew. A man who owned me. "Ryan." Graham said, his gravelly voice dropping an octave, slipping into that commanding hum that vibrated right through the floorboards. "Take the pills." Stop telling me what to do." I yelled, the sudden explosion of anger startling even myself. I shoved away from the glass, my hands shaking violently. "Stop managing me. Stop treating me like a chess piece you just moved across the board. You destroyed Dominic. You destroyed my mother. You won. What else do you want from me?" Graham set the glass and the pills down on the heavy slate coffee table. He stood perfectly still, his pale eye tracking my frantic movements. "I want you to survive the come-down," Graham said quietly. I let out a wet, breathless laugh. Survive, I was surviving. I was doing fine until I met you. You were dying in a freezing alley to spite a woman who didn't care if you lived. Graham stepped closer. The scent of ozone and crushed pepper flared, pushing against my sweet, panicked scent, not attacking it, but wrapping around it, boxing it in. "You are an angry, self-destructive mess, Ryan. And right now, your biology is trying to force you to submit to me, because I just eliminated every threat in your environment." The clinical accuracy of the statement felt like a slap. I opened my mouth to deny it, but my knees betrayed me. A sudden, vicious cramp ripped through my lower abdomen. I stumbled forward with a sharp gasp. Graham caught me before I hit the floor. The impact of the Alpha's solid, heavy chest drove the last of the air from my lungs. Graham's arms locked around me, thick, immovable bars of muscle. The heat radiating through Graham's thin undershirt was staggering. I tried to push away my hands, pressing flat against Graham's chest. "Let go! Let me go!" "Stop fighting." Graham ordered, his grip tightening just enough to restrict my movement without bruising me. I couldn't push away. My hands, acting entirely against my conscious will, curled into the fabric of Graham's shirt. I buried my face in the crook of the Alpha's neck, right against the rough, ruined skin of the burn scar. I breathed in. The scent of dark oak and heavy iron hit my brain like a narcotic. It was terrifying. It was the absolute loss of control I had spent my entire life running from. I was clinging to a monster, and my body was weeping with relief. A choked sob ripped from my throat. I hated myself. I hated the tears that spilled hot and fast against Graham's skin. I hated the way Graham's large calloused hand slowly came up to cradle the back of my head, the thumb tracing a soothing rhythmic circle at the base of my skull. I know, Graham murmured into my hair, his gravelly voice softer than it had any right to be. I know it hurts to stop fighting. Just breathe. I sobbed my fingers, digging desperately into Graham's shoulders as the cold, sterile penthouse finally dissolved into the heavy, suffocating warmth of the Alpha's embrace. I was ruined. I was entirely, irrevocably ruined. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to run away. The hangover from high-grade synthetic suppressants tastes like chalk and old pennies. I woke up with a mouth so dry my tongue stuck to the roof of my palate. I was tangled in heavy dark gray linen sheets. The mattress beneath me was impossibly firm entirely, unlike the lumpy, sagging cot in my old apartment. I lay still for a long time, listening to the hum of the central climate control. Memory returned in slow, jagged fragments. The gala. Dominic Croft's pale, terrified face. My mother's pristine mask shattering into dust. And then the humiliating, devastating collapse in the living room. I remembered crying till my ribs ached, burying my face in the scarred neck of a man who terrified me. My Omega biology screaming for an anchor I had actively tried to avoid. I rolled over, pulling the heavy linen over my face. I wanted to die. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I forced myself out of bed 20 minutes later. My legs felt heavy, disconnected from my brain. I found my clothes from the night before folded neatly on a slate bench at the foot of the bed. I ignored them, pulling on a thick, oversized charcoal bathrobe I found hanging on the bathroom door. It smelled faintly of ozone and peppercorns. It engulfed me entirely. I walked out into the massive living area. The morning sun was violently bright, reflecting off the glass towers of the financial district outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Graham was in the kitchen. He was out of the bespoke suits. The Alpha wore a faded black t-shirt and gray sweatpants. He had reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. His massive scarred head bent over a physical newspaper spread across the marble island. He was holding a mug of black coffee. Without the armor of the suit, the brutal reality of Graham's body was undeniable. The thick scar on his neck disappeared beneath the collar of his t-shirt. But a new one, a jagged white crescent, peeked out from under his left bicep. He looked rough. He looked tired. "There's water on the counter," Graham said. He didn't look up from the paper. "And toast. Your stomach lining is probably wrecked from the suppressants. Eat something dry." I walked over to the island. My bare feet made no sound on the cold slate. I picked up the glass of water and drank it in 3 long, desperate gulps. I ignored the toast. I stood there waiting for the mockery. Waiting for Graham to bring up the pathetic display from the night before. Waiting to be reminded that I was a biological slave to a man who had bought me for $10,000 in an alley. Graham folded the newspaper, carefully placed his glasses on top of it, and finally looked at me. The pale hazel eye tracked over the oversized bathrobe, the messy hair, and the dark circles under my eyes. Graham's expression was unreadable. He reached under the counter and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the cold marble. It stopped inches from my hand. "What is this?" My voice was a rasp wrecked from crying. "Your exit," Graham said. His voice was flat, devoid of the heavy vibrating dominance from the night before. "They are annulment papers. Signed, notarized, and legally binding. I've already transferred $5 million into a secure, untraceable account under your name. The routing numbers are on the 2nd page." I stared at the envelope. My brain, thick with the chemical haze of the suppressants, struggled to process the words. "You're divorcing me," I whispered. "I'm unbinding you," Graham corrected quietly. He picked up his coffee mug. He didn't look at me anymore. He looked out the window at the skyline he had just violently conquered. You came to the lower wards looking for a shield. You got it. Brooke is boarding a flight to Zurich in 2 hours. She has surrendered her shares. She will never step foot in this city again. Dominic Croft is filing for bankruptcy. You are safe. The air in the kitchen grew incredibly still. The suffocating scent of dark oak and iron was gone, pulled back so tightly into Graham's skin that the room smelled of absolutely nothing. It felt clinical. Dead. I told you yesterday. Graham continued, his voice a low, gravelly scrape against the silence. You were bait. You played your part perfectly. The trap snapped. The prey is dead. We have no further use for each other. I pressed my fingertips against the cold edge of the marble counter. A sudden vicious wave of anger ignited in my chest, burning away the chalky taste of the hangover. I was being dismissed. I had let my guard down, let my biology succumb to the sheer, overwhelming safety of this monster's arms. And now I was being handed a severance package like a terminated employee. You arrogant bastard, I hissed. Graham finally turned his head. His right eyebrow twitched upward in faint surprise. You think you can just buy my life, use me to settle whatever vendetta you have against my mother's social circle, watch me have a biological breakdown on your living room floor, and then pay me off. I grabbed the manila envelope. The paper crinkled loudly in my tight grip. Ryan. Graham started, his voice dropping slightly, a hint of warning bleeding into the tone. Ha! Shut up, I snapped. I marched around the kitchen island. I didn't stop until I was standing inches from Graham's chest. The Alpha was seated on a high stool, which put us exactly at eye level. I shoved the envelope hard against Graham's chest. I didn't marry you for $5 million. I married you because I wanted to ruin my life on my own terms. I wanted the ugliest, most pathetic beggar in the gutter. I wanted a disaster. Graham stared at me. The scarred side of his face remained rigid, but the muscle in his jaw feathered tight. I am a disaster, Ryan. Look at me. I am looking at you. I breathed. I didn't blink. I looked at the melted, grafted skin. I looked at the milky, drooping left eye. I looked at the brutal, unyielding line of Graham's mouth. You're a monster. You're cruel. You weaponize your money and your scent, and you isolate yourself in a glass box in the sky because you think everyone is as hollow as the people you destroy. I swallowed hard, my throat clicking in the quiet room. You expect me to take the money and run, because that's what a transaction does. But I'm not a transaction, Graham. I'm your husband. Graham didn't move. The silence stretched tight and brittle, like a guitar string tuned an octave too high. Slowly, the heavy scent of ozone and crushed pepper began to leak back into the air. It wasn't the aggressive, suffocating dominance from the tailor shop, nor the boxing-in comfort from the night before. It was fractured, unsteady. For the first time since I had dragged him out of the freezing rain, Graham Cole smelled uncertain. Ryan, Graham rasped. He didn't take the envelope. He let it fall from my hand to the floor between us. I am 42 years old. Half my face was burned off in a corporate extraction gone wrong a decade ago. I don't know how to be gentle. I don't know how to build things. I only know how to buy them and break them. Graham reached up, his massive callous fingers hovering just an inch from my face, afraid to make contact. If you stay, this is it. This cold apartment. Me. You will be tied to a phantom. I looked at the trembling, scarred hand. I didn't wait for Graham to bridge the gap. I reached up, grabbed Graham's thick wrist, and pressed the rough palm flat against my own cheek. Graham's breath hitched. A harsh, wet sound that scraped the back of his throat. I don't need gentle, I said quietly. I leaned my weight into the alpha's hand, feeling the coarse texture of the calluses against my skin. My own scent, caramelized sugar and bruised petals, finally flared, cutting through the heavy ozone. It wasn't a desperate heat-induced panic this time. It was a deliberate grounding anchor. I spent my whole life surrounded by pristine, gentle people who wanted to sell me for parts. I'm sick of gentle. I moved my free hand, pressing my fingers lightly against the ruined, grafted skin on the left side of Graham's face. The skin there was tight, warm, and uneven. Graham flinched slightly at the contact, a reflexive urge to hide the ugliness. But I didn't let him turn away. I held him there, forcing the alpha to endure being looked at, being touched. "You burned my mother's world down." I whispered, my thumb tracing the jagged edge of the scar along Graham's jaw. "You bought my debts. You bought my enemies. So now you have to deal with me." Graham's pale hazel eye darkened. The unreadable void shattered, replaced by a raw, naked hunger that made my pulse hammer violently against my throat. Graham's arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me flush against his chest. The heavy, dark oak scent surged, wrapping around my sweetness, locking it into place. It was possessive. It was absolute. "You're a spiteful, stubborn creature," Graham murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated right through my ribs. "I learned from the best," I replied, resting my forehead against Graham's shoulder. We stood there in the harsh morning light, surrounded by cold glass and brushed steel. There was no magical epiphany. The trauma of the past didn't vanish into the ether, and the ugliness of the world we lived in hadn't changed. We were two jagged, ruined pieces forced together by spite and survival. But as Graham's hand stroked the back of my neck, steady, warm, and unyielding, I realized I didn't care about the cold outside. The cage was locked. The key was thrown away. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I wanted to be. If you enjoyed this dark, emotional dive into the Omegaverse, hit that like button to let us know. We love bringing you these raw, grounded stories full of intense drama, shifting power dynamics, and characters who are beautifully flawed. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow BL and ABO fans who crave a story with real bite. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Tell us in the comments, what was your favorite sensory detail in Ryan and Graham's journey? See you in the next story.